Hey everyone, welcome back. We've got so many balls in the air, it's not even funny. I'm Susan Smith of Stitched by Susan, and today I'm coming to you live from Stitch House in Richardson, Texas. So working in front of a live audience today and getting a quilt accomplished. So much like my usual live and unscripted shows, I'm working on an actual client quilt. This one happens to belong to my sister, little Sunbonnet Sue quilt. So this morning's session, we talked a lot about the loading process, the backing, seams in the backing, getting it all loaded smooth, all those sorts of things. So this afternoon we're going to keep on the same quilt, and I've got the whole first pass done, and I'm going to advance it and talk you through a whole lot of that process. So I've got some great tips for that. Now again, if you missed this morning's session and are not familiar with my show, my particular style of quilting is to quilt free motion. So I'm running the machine and doodling freehand, and also to do edge to edge type design. So same thing quilted across the whole quilt. Couch quilts, I call them, but quilts that'll be gifts for grads, for kids, for seniors, these sorts of things. So that is in fact what I'm doing today. And this is an applique quilt, and I know some of you will just not be very happy with me for quilting over applique, but it's what I'm doing because the purpose of this quilt is just to be a cuddly quilt. It's not for show, it's not to enter into shows or anything like that. So we're just laying this lovely floral hibiscus texture over it. And I'm just checking with Mr. Producer on the sound. Are you guys hearing that? It sounds terribly poppy to me. Sound is just a struggle. It just is. Anyway. Oh, here comes Mr. Producer to fix it. It doesn't stay there. That's the problem. I'm such an in-motion sort of person. The mic will not stay unless I stand still. Okay. So just a tiny quick rundown. I'm stitching on a Bernina Q24. It is not hooked up to a digital Q-matic system. It is just literally freehanding today. I'm using an eggshell, Isacord, 40 weight polyester thread. I have the same thread top and bottom of my quilt. What else? Yeah, we talked about those things this morning, and then this afternoon, as I advance it, we're going to talk specifically today about creating beautiful stitches. So that does mean tension, but it also means what I call stitch formation, which is a lot more than just tension. So as I work this afternoon, that's kind of going to be the topic, and some of the troubleshooting, because that can be a troublesome topic sometimes. So let's get started. At this end here, by the way, we have a little practice sandwich, and so the folks that are in the room were able to have a chance during our lunch break to play around a little bit with the machine. So I'm going to undo my clamping system at the sides, preparatory to rolling. And again, you may remember from this morning, on this machine, because it's not my own machine, my ratchets are at one end of the frame and my wheel is at the other end of the frame, so I have to keep walking back and forth, so you get to see that. So we're just going to advance the quilt, and you probably can't see well on camera how far my quilting extends, but I can see it here in real life. So I'm just advancing till I have a few inches of clearance left below the dead bar here to know that I can get at that all and quilt it. Put my ratchets back in place. Now, tension of quilt is a big deal when you're working at a long arm. How tight to make these rails, because of course I could ratchet them right down and have that quilt really stretched. But it's my experience and many quilters' experience that having the fabric stretched too tight produces problems. It produces poorly shaped stitches, it produces skipped stitches, and if you get extreme enough, you'll get broken threads and even a broken needle. When you think of it this way, that needle is going up and down maybe as much as 1,500 or 2,000 or more times per minute, and it is actually flexing because you're moving as it's going up and down, right? So there's a certain amount of flex there. So the tighter your fabric is, the less, what's the word I want, for room for error, margin for error there is in that. And so you're more apt then, if your quilt is tight, you're more apt to have these tension issues, broken threads, skip stitches, all those things. So when I see that happening, the first thing I do is lessen that tension on my quilt top. And what I feel like is a good rule of thumb is if I reach under with my fingers straight up like this, I reach under my quilt, I should be able to grab my fingertips almost down to that first knuckle. That's how loose my quilt is. It is only tight enough to keep it from sagging. That's all I'm trying to do. So that's true both of the rails, front to back, and also true of my side clamps. I don't want to be creating a drum I could beat on. I just want enough tension so it's not forming wrinkles. So we've advanced the quilt. With every advance, I walk along the front and I grab both the quilt top, which remember from this morning is floating, hanging down here. So I grab it and I grab the batting also. And I just give them a little tug to make sure there's no extras getting in the way under there. I also will be watching if there are seam lines that are horizontal on my quilt. Are they straight? That's my first guide to, is my quilt progressing straight? If I happen to have wobbly borders with waviness in them, would be the time I'd be adjusting, and I would do that every time I advance. If I leave that until I get to the bottom of the quilt, if I just smooth everything down and then quilt it and then smooth everything down, I'm apt to have problems when I get to the bottom of the quilt, and then it will be sort of too late to fix it without pleats or big adjustments. But if I do a little bit in each section, then I can usually manage it. This quilt happens to be quite nice and flat, but lots of times I work with quilts that have either puffy insides or wavy borders or whatever the case may be, and you can deal with quite a lot if you take it bite at a time. So that's how we're advancing it. Now, I was talking with my students here in the room over lunch. It wouldn't be live and unscripted if we didn't have a challenge on the spot, and sure enough, either I put my batting on the wrong direction or I cut it too small at home in my prep. Either one could have happened. And what's going to happen is I have just enough on this side, but on this side over here, I don't even have quite enough. Can you see that? I'm running a little short of my actual quilt space. So as we get down there, we're going to get to see a batting splice today, because it wouldn't be a show if we didn't have a problem. So everything's nice and smooth. Next step then is going to be to baste the left and the right. Now, when I ran my earlier first pass, if I was at home, I would have dropped my magnetic bars on the front, but I didn't haul them with me because they weigh a lot. And so what I did is I just laid a row of pins along this front edge. So I'm going to take those pins out right now and keep them here, because I'll use them again in a moment. And all that does is, when I'm quilting, I don't want this to be pulling up, not even a 1/4 inch. I want this to stay perfectly straight. So my magnets work, a row of pins works. If you've got some kind of C-clamps, that works. You can even run a line of basting all the way across. Any way that you choose that stabilizes this quilting area so it can't shift then while you're working. Okay, back to our 4 stitches to the inch basting stitch. Pulling up our bobbin thread and hanging on to it. Running down this side edge. Now I am doing this by eye in terms of keeping it straight. Certainly if you have a larger quilt, or if you're not comfortable just winging it by eye, you might have some type of tape measure or some way that you're measuring or centering. I am doing it by eye today. On a quilt this small, I'm pretty comfortable with that and being able to keep it square. Sometimes I do, and I think you can probably see this on camera, I'll reach on my backing, the area that's already been quilted, it is wanting to pull in a little bit, and I'll just give it that little tug, which can make surprisingly about a 1/4 inch of difference, and I can do the same thing at the other side. And all I'm doing is just kind of stretching out again that bit that's been quilted and that's wanting to pull in. And again, the bigger the quilt, the more that is exaggerated, and the more you have to be conscious of that and fixing it, dealing with it as you go. I'm just using my fingers to make sure that fabric's feeding under the needle and not getting pushed out in front of it. A few lock stitches and we're golden. Don't you love my little scissors receptacle? Whatever works. Another thing that you can do with your pins is, if you have a hard time knowing how far forward you can stitch, if you pull your machine right to that front rail and lay your pins in a line with that, that will give you a visual guide. And for the design that I'm stitching today, which is hibiscus, it's kind of a largish one, this can be helpful so that you can always kind of look up and see, oh, I've got to finish this flower and get moving in the other direction. Let's measure that again. Oh yeah, I got lots of room on that last one. Perfect. Now we'll put our little end clamps on. And again, just enough tension on these to hold it snug. We're not pulling it like this. Can you see that pull in the fabric? We don't want that. We just want enough. It's basically just the weight of the clamp that's holding it snug. Okay, we're ready to start stitching. Now, I'm going to go in the opposite direction that I did in the first pass. So the first pass I started in the top right corner, stitched all the way left. Now I'm going to start in the left, stitch all the way right. This just keeps my flowers from looking like they're all being blown by the wind in one direction. Do we have any burning questions, Mr. Producer, before I go on into stitching? Okay. Okay, I am going to talk for a second about a viewer this morning asked, and actually I should have paused right at the end, but now that I'm remembering, this is a good time to talk about it, so I'm not going to wait. A viewer online this morning asked about, did I take a moment to stitch a test sample to make sure that my tension and everything was working well this morning before I started? Because of course this is not my machine, and obviously it's going to be a little different than mine, or it could be. What do I do about that? It's hard to quantify this answer, but I'll do my very best. I stitch quite a lot at my long arm, and I literally know what my bobbin should feel like when I do this. So you hear a lot of long arm quilters talk about the dangle test, and what they mean is that you can lay your bobbin on your hand and pull it up like this, and that sweet spot where it pulls the bobbin casing up straight but doesn't quite lift it off your hand is perfect. Now there are gauges you can use to test that too, absolutely, but I won't get into that a ton today. Just know this is the easiest way to test your bobbin tension. But when you stitch a lot, you become really attuned to exactly what that feels like. Just that pull on it, you know what that feels like. So I tend to dangle it on my hand. I also do it when I insert the bobbin in the machine. Right? I pull a little bit right there. I'm getting a feel again. If I haven't got it inserted correctly, or if it's fallen out of the thread guide, that will feel different. Alert. But no, it feels good, so on I go. And then I proceed to my stitching. And I've caught my sweater on the rail. Oh, sorry, yes, close the bobbin casing. And by the way, you can stitch with it open, but it's not wise because you can bump it on things. It's not like a sewing machine. It doesn't complain. It doesn't warn you. But you can bump it on things, so it's not wise. But right here, when I pull up my bobbin thread, once again, I pull, and I judge that feel. And I often don't talk about it because I'm just going through my steps of things that I do on the regular, right? But those are 3 quick places that I'm judging the feel of my bobbin, and in this case, also my needle thread because I'm pulling on them. If they were at all not quite what they should be, I'd stop. I'd rethread my bobbin, I'd possibly rethread my needle. I would take steps right then. So that was a very long answer to the question, which was, did you do some test stitching before you started out? The truth is we did load the machine up yesterday with some fabric, and I had done a little, but I changed thread overnight, and I didn't do a test swatch at that point. I relied on this. It works for me. Now, if you don't stitch every day, maybe you're not quite as closely attuned to what that should feel like, and maybe you do want to either use a TOA gauge to test your bobbin or run a little test sample at the side, much like we've got going over here. Perfectly acceptable ways to do it. I just wanted to explain why I don't and how I take that shortcut in my stitching. So now all I've done is I've overlapped just a little bit of the area where we were stitching. I'm going to take a few quick lock stitches, and then we're up and running again. So I'm just going to stitch for a little while. You guys be thinking of any questions if you have them. If any of you in the room want to come up and watch the stitching, you're more than welcome to. Doesn't bother me at all. Just know that there are cameras on you. So I'm stitching a hibiscus design today. There are some hibiscus-like flowers in this border print, so it seemed very fitting. So I'm filling in my design all the way down to the bottom of where I can reach on this pass. And then I'll work my way up to the top and start filling in that top edge. If you weren't tuned in this morning and didn't have a chance to see questions that were asked then, someone asked about the height of the machine because my machine at home is so much taller than this. And here you're seeing a good example of why I like mine to be taller. Can you see that I have to hunch over a fair bit in order to see where the stitching is happening, in order to kind of see under the needle. And so my machine at home I experimented with a little bit with what height felt good to me and helped me maintain decent posture. And in practice I would say mine's about 4 inches higher than this one is right now. But that's going to vary depending on your height and even the depth of the throat space of your machine. But I do definitely know that I tend to have mine higher than most long arm dealers necessarily recommend. But that just has to do with my style of quilting. This fairly fast, fairly sprawling quilting design. It's easier for me to have it at a higher height, but I'm not doing intricate, close work. So while I quilt, let's talk about some more factors that directly affect the quality of your stitches. So we've certainly mentioned already the tightness at which your quilt sandwich is loaded or stretched. That can definitely affect the beauty of your stitches. And of course, so can that bobbin tension that we were talking about. In the lunch break, I was also talking with some students about bobbin winders. So in the case of the Bernina machines, we have our bobbin winder built right onto the side of the machine. In fact, you're seeing it right here. It's a separate motor, and you wind your bobbin right there. The beauty of having a winder that has a separate motor from your stitching is that it winds with a consistent speed. And that is really key to getting a well-wound bobbin. You can imagine, if you've got a bobbin that's got tighter and looser areas, you're definitely going to have trouble making consistent, beautiful stitches. So having well-wound bobbins is really critical. I was talking to a student who's in my master class the other day, and she was just having consistent and ongoing tension issues. And we kind of worked down the list, tried everything, and eventually she actually went to a friend's and had them wind some bobbins for her to see if that made a difference, and it did. So that's what we literally narrowed it down to, was her bobbin winder was not giving her a consistent tension, and therefore a poor result. There are more things than I can cover today that affect the quality of your stitches, but as I think of them today, I'll try and bring them to light, because there just are so many. It is not just the tension, certainly, that is applied to your thread. You notice that I'm slowing down just a little right there. As I stitch over this applique, it does have a stabilizer underneath it, so it is a little bit stiffer. So I just slow down, give my needle a chance to make some pretty stitches there. This quilt is not particularly thick, but certainly that principle holds true for more severe quilts, like t-shirt quilts are a great example when they're really, really thick, or some super bulky seam allowances. Slowing down can often help. Just gives your machine a little time to deal with it, whatever you're throwing at it. Move that mic again. I feel like you're hearing me breathe. It's so loud. Oh, okay. So Oh, so what you're saying is I should quilt for a while and then I should stop and then I should talk for a while. Would this be better? Okay, I'll totally do that. Okay, could you hand me my water bottle, Mr. Producer, sir? And I'm going to have a drink of water, and I'll talk to you guys for a couple minutes. Okay, so let's highlight then what I've been saying and you perhaps didn't catch any of. Just talking about the things that affect stitch formation, making pretty stitches. So one of the first ones that I talked about was the tightness, the stretch on the quilt sandwich, definitely a factor. But bobbin quality or bobbin winding or consistency in bobbin tension, all of that has a big effect too. So a lot of, well, I won't say a lot. There are different ways to wind bobbins. A number of long arm machines will have an onboard bobbin winder, which you can put a bobbin on and it's literally winding while you're sewing, but it speeds and slows down just like your sewing does, and you end up with a bobbin that's got tighter and looser tension. So to me, that I've never seen one of those work well. All the quilters I know that have an onboard winder end up getting a separate one because you just get a better result. So the story that I was telling was a student in my master class. She was just having ongoing breakage and tension issues, ongoing, and we tried this, tried that, tried the other. And eventually I suggested that she go, I can't remember if she went to a dealership or to a friend, but anyway had someone else wind her some bobbins to see if that was the problem, just trying to narrow down where that problem was. And in fact it was. The results were like night and day. So all it was is that she was not getting a good, consistent tension of wind on her bobbin. So that can be really, really important. One of the things that is so easy on the Bernina machine is that the tension is represented on this screen and it's numerical. So often tension on sewing machines too will be a dial, but where did you start? Where's your baseline? How do you ever get back to it? When you change thread and you change that tension and then you want to go back to what your favorite old thread, like how do you know? I've resorted to like taking a Sharpie to it, you know, here's the baseline, but it's a bit half-assed way of doing it. So on the Bernina machine, you literally can see it. It's a numerical number, it's 4.0. And if I change it, I'm not sure if you can see this fully from your screen, but if I change it, now my box is outlined in yellow, and this happens throughout Bernina menus. There's a default, and if your box is showing yellow, you aren't on the default. So it doesn't mean you're wrong, it just means if you want that default, hit the box. Boop, you go right back to that baseline, just like that. Kelly was mentioning this morning that you could program in users who have certain preferences, and tension is one of them. So for example, I stitch a lot of quilts with my Isacord poly thread, so I've got my very basic tensions programmed in there. But I also like using metallic thread, and that takes quite a bit of adjustment. I need my top tension to be a lot lower, and I often put a fine thread in the bobbin, so I need that one a little tighter. So I take my favorite brand of metallic thread, and I call it metallic, and I put the tensions in there. So now with the push of one button, I can go back and forth between my fun metallic and my basic Isacord. So that's a nice thing about the tension. And I don't know that I emphasized enough, but it is a big deal, the onboard bobbin winder with its own separate motor. So we'll be winding one today. Maybe I should just do it now because there's no time like the present, is there? Let's just stop our stitching for a sec. Do you have a spare bobbin, Jessica? Or someone? I just realized I actually filled all the bobbins I brought with me. I need one more bobbin to do this. While they're looking for that, we'll talk about threading for a moment. Threading is lovely on the Bernina too because it is all right at the front of the machine. Typically on a long arm, the cones are held at the back of the machine and you pull them forward. And it's not that they're harder necessarily to thread, it's just you've always got to go back there and swap out that cone. So the ease of the Bernina, it's as easy as your sewing machine, absolutely, to thread. So let's quickly thread it. So I snipped the thread, pulled it forward out of the machine, and now I'm starting a new one. I like to hold on to it with my left hand so that I've got something to pull against, and I simply thread it through across in the front. I won't give you all the details because you can't necessarily see from where you are, But just know it's all right here at the front, and it's so, so, so simple. That's the only fiddly part, is doing that hook. Right to the bottom, and we're set to go. And Bernina machines use regular flat-backed sewing machine needles, which is genius. They are the only long arm on the market that does that. And what that gives me is a needle threader, because my needle is always in precisely the same position. And then it kind of makes a fool out of me by not working. So I don't know if any of you have experience with other long arm brands. I've used a few, and they all do have their things that are wonderful. Certainly they do. But what's true among all of them is they have a long arm needle, which has a round shank on it. So there's a process for putting it in, because you've got to get that shank directionally just right. So most of us used to use, I had a tiny little magnet that was a 1/4 inch long, a little tiny tube, an 1/8 inch wide and 1/4 inch long, and you would put that on the front of the needle because it would show you where the eye of the needle was exactly. Or you could like stick a pin in the eye of the needle and, you know, is it at 12 o'clock or at 6 o'clock, right? And that's how we did it. So with the flat back, there isn't any of that because you can only do it one way. So it's very, very nice. Thank you. And in addition, then you can use the fun needles that you could use on your sewing machine. You can pull out your jeans needle or your top stitch needle, or indeed your twin needle, and run 2 threads through, because they all fit. They're all interchangeable. Okay, bobbin winding. Here we go. You just put that bobbin on there. Grab the spool of thread. That's important. And again, on my machine at home, my favorite threads, I have 2. So I've got one for my bobbin, one for my machine. You don't have to, but it sure is a convenience that's lovely. Around that bobbin a few times. Around the cutter. Well, Susan's making a fool of herself again. Poly thread is a little bit slippery, so you got to do a few winds around that cutter. And for those of you, is there anyone in here who does love poly thread? Are you guys it? Someone gave me one tiny tip for this, which I will show you. And that is going behind your thread and grabbing this one under, thus forming one simple cross. And that little difference can help it slip and let go, which is what you saw me do just a moment ago, right? So let's see if I can do it this time. At home, I'm always standing at a certain angle, right? And I just go boop, boop, boop. And then when you try and reproduce that slowly, it doesn't always work. So that's the bobbin winding. And I can keep on stitching and doing all my things while that's happening if I have another spool of thread, because it's entirely independent. So Jessica's making a point in the audience that a lot of freestanding bobbin winders still have that tension dial that you have to mess with, because you can change the tension on the bobbins too. I've never changed the tension on how my bobbin winds on here. You can change things like how full the bobbin gets. That's probably true on most machines, but it's just the turn of a screw on here to make your bobbin wind a little fuller or a little less full. Speaking of stitch formation, because that's today's topic, if your bobbin is filling right to the very, very tippy outside full, you're apt to have problems. Think of the bobbin in its casing, and when it goes to spin, if it's any too full, you get a little bit of resistance until those first few yards are used. So the answer is just turn this down a touch. Make your bobbin, 9/10 full and not 10.5 full, and you'll have much better success with that. If we had another spool of thread, we could keep going, because we still do have bobbin thread. Oh, there's some Q&As online. Let's take some questions online. That's a great idea, Mr. Producer, sir. Nancy, how do you check your tension on the back, and how often do you check it? Well, this kind of goes back, Nancy, to my earlier topic about I just, almost without thinking about it, check my bobbin and my needle thread by pulling on them. And that, to me, proves to solve almost all of my tension problems. I very seldom have a tension issue on the back of the quilt. So I don't check it very often is the answer. Now, there are a few ways you can do it. One is certainly to tip it up and peek. Another is to take a handheld mirror. I've certainly done this, and my phone flashlight in one hand, and step at the back of my quilt, with mirror and flashlight. And certainly you can crawl right under there and check it too. I typically don't. If you're having trouble, it takes less time to check than to undo, and that's a fact. So be aware of that. Okay, we've got a bobbin. Do we have more questions? Okay, let's do those. Linda, which direction would you prefer the nap of cuddle backing to be? Smooth from top to bottom or reverse? Honestly, Linda, I've never taken care to make it one or the other, so I guess I don't have a preference, is the answer to that one. Judy, does this machine tell you when the bobbin's almost empty, or do you just tell by the sound of the bobbin? Mine makes a certain sound when it's almost empty. So true, and I hear a lot of Bernina owners say that. Our bobbins rattle. They're metallic, and they rattle a little bit when they're close to empty, so you can tell it's coming. I do have an indicator on my machine. I personally don't use it, because the way the indicator works is you have to tell it in advance how many yards your bobbin holds of that brand of thread, and that's just too much work for me to figure out. I just quilt till it runs out, and then I change it over, and I will be doing that at some point today. We'll be splicing in a fresh thread over a run-out bobbin. Nancy, do you look pre-wound bobbins? Do you like pre-wound bobbins to help alleviate tension issues from home-wound bobbins? You know, I've not used them a lot. Wonderfil gave me a bunch just a little while ago, so in the last couple of months I've used more of them, but I've not had difficulty with my home-wound bobbins. And I like having all the matching threads on my home wound bobbins, so I'm still going to gravitate toward those. I prefer that so that I can have my color of choice. Pre-wound bobbins have a limited color selection. Cindy, do you know a brand of freestanding bobbin winder that works well? Well, I had a Gamble one, and that worked well. It was branded for their machines, and that worked super well for me. Beyond that, I don't have particular advice to give, no, because of course now I'm spoiled with the onboard, and I love that on my Bernina. Lori, how do you figure out spacing between each row? I always have a hard time with my row spacing. So do you mean like how far to advance in order to fit in your next row, Lori, or just how close to put the quilting? Because in terms of how close to put the quilting, I just make it similar to how my flowers were spaced in that first advance, right? And try to get that same look. It's not a precise science. It really isn't.
And one with this one?
And one more.
Oh, no, we won't.
It's coming. Oh, apparently it went away. Someone retracted it.
All
All right. You get to see it being threaded again. Oh, it's up now. Shriel, this is not a quilting question, but I can't help myself. Did you make your little jacket super cute? No, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't. I always say I could have. I could crochet a little jacket, but no, it was handcrafted by Amazon. Okay, and someone in the live audience, do remind me when my bobbin does run out to do a little spot of oiling. And if one of the staff, actually I've got an oiling pen here, no worries. I'm trying to think of all the things that I do fairly regularly that I can pack in to this and show you all those details while we're here together. And usually when I'm at home, I have a blue seam ripper that lives in my little red solo cup right here, and I drop my blue seam ripper wherever I stopped, because you know how hard it is to figure out where it was that I ended this? So there's good reason for that. But here it is. I have found it. So again, I'm pulling on both those threads. That, you know, some of you watching may think, gosh, that's wasteful to pull 12 inches of thread out, but that's my tension test. I know what that bobbin thread feels like, I know what that top thread feels like, and they're right. And I can tell you in a second if there's any catch in it or if it's running without tension on it. Like I can tell that by feel, and you'll learn that too when you quilt a fair bit. And if that doesn't work for you, then you do just run a test sample. That is absolutely a workaround. Just going to pause and snip those little thread tails. Where's my cup? Oh, I actually made a mistake there. I thought the edge of my Sunbonnet Sue was the edge of my last quilted flower, but you know what? We'll just stretch some petals out, and it will be totally fine. There's my newly wound bobbin, just fell off the top. Let's just park it right there. Okay, turn the handle like so. Better for camera view. Okay. I feel like it's working pretty well to quilt a minute and then do some more chatting. So if that's okay with everybody, that's what we're going to keep doing. Mr. Producer, would you hand me my Bernina wrap-up thingy that's there? Yes, thank you. I brought along some needles to show you, because this too really affects your stitches. A few months ago, I was on air, because that's where most of my learning experiences happen, let's be honest. And I was working on a quilt that was, it was a memory quilt, and so it had different types of fabrics, like very different. Polycotton broadcloths, ripstop nylon, satin, a little bit of everything, right? And I was having so much trouble with thread breakage. Like, we're talking 10, 20, 30 times, and I'm on air, right, like I am today, live streaming this quilt, and I'm having just a disastrous time. Till I finally said, you know what, I think I'm just going to have to go and find some solutions, because this is not working. What we're doing is not working. So I went and chatted with a friend of mine who owns a quilt shop, and she's 80-something. She's been sewing forever. Anna, what do I need to do to fix this problem? And she said, you need a different kind of needle. So until that point, I had been using chiefly universal needles in a pretty average size, a 90-14 size. And what she suggested to me was actually a top stitch needle. So I have some here for you to look at of several different kinds, and you can kind of, I don't know that you can visibly see the differences, but you can look at least the description differences. Bernina recommends, this is a 90-14 universal needle, and that's what I typically use to begin with, and I've also bought them from Schmitz. These are made by Schmitz too, I'm pretty sure. So that's an all-purpose needle with an all-purpose point that covers a ton of your bases. But the top stitch needle, I can pass some of these around. What's different about the top stitch needle is that the scarf area, which is the area that includes the eye is longer. So Anna's theory is that longer eye just allows more free movement of the thread through it and results in less breakages. So good news, I did get through that quilt with like 5 more thread breaks instead of 40, so it seemed to bear out Anna's statement. But long story short, I've kind of switched to that, and the top stitch needle, still in a 90-14 size, has become my current favorite. So for whatever that's worth. And then, of course, because this is using sewing machine needles, you can use, this is a metallic needle, which is a specialty needle. You can throw ballpoint needles on it. Certainly I've thrown jeans needles on it, which are quite robust and thick. So all of those are just as easy as switching out the needle on your sewing machine. And in fact, my stock of needles is the same for both machines, because I just have one needle supply. So this can make a real difference then in your stitch quality. And in fact, if you're getting skipped stitches, like number one thing to do is put a fresh needle in. Whatever needle you're using, just new needle, fresh sharp needle. Lots of quilters recommend changing the needle every quilt. I honestly don't. I wait until I see some signs that there's something wrong. If I'm doing a batik quilt and it's queen sized, I might have to use 2 needles in the course of a quilt. It dulls so quickly. But a quilt like this is not going to wear out a needle. I'll be able to do another 1 or 2 or 3 lap size quilts. But as soon as I have any stitch problems, or as soon as I hear that distinct pop, 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 pop of a dull needle, then it's time to change. That's the first thing I do, is go to that. So that's another thing. So what have we talked about now for stitch formation? We've talked about tightness of quilt sandwich. We've talked about well-wound bobbins and overall good tension. We've talked about different needles having a different effect. There was something else in there, and now I'm forgetting and running down my list. We haven't really talked about the specific tension. What you're working with at a sewing machine and at a long arm is you're forming a straight stitch. You've got a top thread and a bobbin thread, and they're meeting and twisting and going on, and meeting and twisting and going on. And in the perfect quilt, that meet and twist and knot falls right between all the layers. And actually quilts are pretty forgiving because they've got a pretty fluffy layer there. So whenever you do get tension that looks off, so for example, maybe your top stitching looks almost straight. The bottom stitches look very distinct and separate, but your top thread is lying almost straight. That's a disparity between your tension. So I'm going to ask my in-house crowd, what would you do if your top thread was laying too straight? You'd already measured your bobbin and it had a nice amount of tension on it. My bobbin's pretty good, but my top one is pulling straight. What do I do? Anybody? This is like going back to school. Anybody? Go ahead. You absolutely could tighten the bobbin or loosen the top. So here's my sort of rule of thumb. Longarm manufacturers, Bernina included, will usually give you a recommended tension for the bobbin. And I was showing you the dangle test earlier. That is a really good all-purpose test, but if you want to know exactly what that pull is in millinewtons, then a gauge will do that for you. A TOA gauge, or Bernina has a branded gauge which does exactly the same thing. And you just fit your bobbin casing in it. It's a little pulley system, and it gives you a readout of what that tension is. Well, they recommend 210 to 220. So here's where I start. First, I start with my bobbin. Is it giving me 210 to 20? If it is, then I know my bobbin is right. And if that top thread is running a little too tight, then I loosen it. But I still always start with, am I sure my bobbin is right? So imagine, we were chatting in this morning's session briefly about using 80 weight threads, finer threads. What do you think you'd have to do with your bobbin tension if you put a finer thread in it? You'd have to tighten it up a little bit. It'd be slipping through way too quickly. So you'd still want that 210 to 220, but most likely you would have to tighten the screw and tighten the tension a little bit to achieve that 210 to 220. So if I was changing thread types, that's always where I'd start. Make sure my bobbin's right. And then the fine tuning happens with your top tension. But I don't start by saying, ooh, my stitches are ugly, let's start manhandling that top tension. That's not the best place to start. Make sure that bobbin is within its safety margin first off. Okay, shall we stitch some more? We got questions on that. There's some comments online. Let's take them. There's my trusty water bottle. Debbie, the Schmetz rep who talked at my guild meeting suggested to change the needle when you hear it popping through the fabric. Agreed. That popping is generally an indicator of a dull needle, with the small caveat that certain fabrics just pop no matter what. The needle can be fresh as fresh and it will still pop. So, Janice is suggesting you can discuss how direction plays a factor. This is such a can of worms, I hate to open it up. So many long arms stitch happily, like we do handwriting, from left to right, and less happily stitch from right to left. And I'm just not going to be able to answer that whole question today because there's so many factors that play into it. But in many cases, it's the same ones that give you ugly stitches. It can be things like stitch sandwich too tight, right? Bobbin too full. Those things can affect that as well. So I'll see in Facebook groups or whatever, you'll see people making these blanket statements like long arms only stitch from left to right. I'm here to tell you that isn't true. They are mechanical machines and they're intended to stitch both directions. But the same way that all these little factors play into beautiful stitches, many little factors play into which direction they stitch comfortably as well. I showed you guys early this morning, I don't even know where it went, my Christmas quilt that has straight line quilting in both directions. I did that one in both directions and it's pretty happy. So, okay. More comments. Mr. Producer keeps reining me in. Judy, what stitch mode are you using? So far I've been using the stitch regulator, the BSR1. I'm going to get into the manual one yet this afternoon for sure. Well, that's it. Okay. My Bernina much prefers left to right. I mean, so interesting, but I still think it may prefer that, but I do think there are factors that are contributing to that. There's just so many of them. There's so many of them. Okay, let's stitch a little more, and I'm going to do some manual stitching for you. Here's, yes, you sure can.
On your gamble, did you have a fully round needle, or was that a flat back needle as well?
So someone is asking if my gamble had a fully round needle or a flat back. It was a round. I'm not aware of anybody besides Bernina that offers the flat back needle. All the long arms use the round one.
Change it on another brand. It's pretty complicated, right? Because you're having to make sure you get it directly at the center.
Yeah, so the question is it more complicated to change the needle? Yes, because you had to take extra measures with either a magnet or a pin or something that helped you get that needle in there just so. Yeah, where the flat back just eliminates all that question. Okay. Earlier session, quick recap, we talked about the stitch regulator and what it does. Stitch regulators across long arms work in different ways, sometimes on the encoders, sometimes on the belts, but on the Bernina, it is two little cameras that are right here on my foot plate that are literally watching the movement of the fabric and adjusting. So when I say to my machine, I would like to achieve 10 stitches per inch, If I move slowly at a creeping pace, then that motor's going to go slowly to give me 10 stitches per inch. If I'm zooming along with my quilting, that motor's going to really rev up so that it's going faster so that I'm still getting 10 stitches in every inch. So that's a stitch regulator. It is a super helpful tool because then it's one less thing you have to think about. And that's what I've been stitching with so far. And I'm going to do it a little bit more so you can hear the sound of it, and then we're going to talk about something really fun. So do you hear when I go slowly and when I speed up? That's the sound of my machine regulating how fast it needs to go to keep achieving my 10 stitches per inch. Okay, so we have one more setting on the Bernina machine, and most longarm machines have this in some form or another, and it's called manual or constant or unregulated. Those all mean the same thing. On our machine, it's man. No woman, just man. What that means is I'm going to now tell it what speed I want the needle to go. And then it's my job to move the machine to achieve however many stitches per inch. So when I push start, that needle's just going to start going, and I am responsible to start moving. And if I move fast, I'm going to get great galloping stitches. And if I move too slow, I'm going to get 100 in every inch, right? So you'll hear it. The sound of my machine is going to be absolutely smooth now. The needle's going to be moving at an absolutely fixed rate. Okay, let's just get this set at my comfort zone here. Okay, ready? Did you hear the difference? Everybody hear the difference? It's quite remarkable, isn't it? So why would you want one over the other? Why would you want this and not have the machine do that work for you? Well, from my point of view, if I'm standing working a couple of hours on a quilt like this, it's actually quite wearing to hear the motor revving and slowing and revving and slowing and revving and slowing. This is much smoother as to sound. And for me anyway, it helps me literally quilt more smoothly. I just get in a smoother groove. Stitch regulator obviously has its choices, has its benefits. I think those are evident. You know, it just takes the work out of thinking about that for you. But using the manual, it can be a welcome break just in that sound. I personally believe that it causes you to become a better quilter because you have to learn how to move smoothly and evenly. You have to stop jerking. You can't zoom and then stop and then zoom and then stop. You'll get very messy stitching. So it pushes you into learning how to be a very smooth quilter. So it has its real advantages. A lot of quilters will say you can get smoother curves with it. Somehow when the stitch regulator is on, there's that little bit of resistance in the machine as it's making adjustments, right? Because it's always adjusting for you. So if you're trying to do a bubble fill, for example, with little pebbles, little bubbles, you'll find that it will go smoother and you'll get rounder circles if you go in the manual mode. So it is very worth experimenting for sure and seeing what feels comfortable for you and pushing yourself a little bit to try the new one. So I'm going to stay in manual mode for a little bit and do a few more flowers, and then we'll take a few more questions. See how my pins marked my little boundary right there? I knew it was time to start going back to the east. Okay, any questions in the room?
How long does it take to finish a project like this without the charity?
Without talking, to being on air like this. The question is how long it takes to finish a quilt like this. Oh gosh, I think 2 hours would be plenty of time. So 2 hours or less to finish a lap size quilt. This one is about 55 by 65. Yeah, I mean, it depends obviously on how much quilting you're doing and all of that, but yeah. Sorry, go ahead, in the front row for a minute.
What is the speed at which, do you set the speed at which you do it, or do you do it by ear when you go into manual mode?
So Tammy's asking if I set the speed by which I do it, or if I do it by ear. So what I'm telling it is stitches per inch. Do you want me to try it on a much lower one and you can hear the difference? And I have fooled around with that and kind of found my favorite. If I was quilting something very fine and dense, I would make it slower. But listen to this and how much different it sounds. Can you hear that? And I simply have to move a lot slower now to keep 10 or so stitches in every inch of mine. So for me, that's 1,400 a minute, but that may be wildly different for another person. That's just what I'm comfortable at. So, Luann.
So I find that at start and stop, my stitches will be either really close together or really far apart. Is there a suggestion how to avoid that?
So when you're in the manual mode, you're saying your stitches are either quite short or quite close together as you start and as you stop, because it's not adjusting. You know, different long arms actually do handle that differently, and the Bernina is right about in the middle of the pack for that. The more you do it, the more like you just gauge how quick to jump into that, just how quick to start moving to catch up with the speed you're setting. And of course it makes a difference what speed you're stitching at too. So I don't have a magic answer for you, I'm sorry. If only it were magic, right? Sounds like practice. It does sound like that, yes. Okay, let's take a couple questions on air, and then I think we'll wind down with our airing on YouTube. By the way, you guys have been a great audience today. This has been such a stretch for Mr. Producer and I, because it's the first time ever in front of a live audience. So just the whole process of like miking to a room and miking out to YouTube, like all those things. So thanks for joining us. It's been fun. Let's take a comment here. Okay, I need the online audience to come up with a stumper. Susan's getting it too easy with the in-house folks. 36,769 brownie points if you can stumper. Well, I didn't have a really good answer for that last one. Okay, any stumpers out there?
The only one was Janice's. She thought she had you.
Janice thought she had it with the direction question. I mean, you kind of did, Janice, because I did have to admit, I don't have a hard and fast answer for that one. I do have kind of a checklist of things I go down when I'm having trouble with that. So I think we're going to sign off then on air. 10:30 Central Time tomorrow morning. We'll be back. Fresh project will be loaded, and we'll be doing some other topics tomorrow. So I'll catch you all then. See you later.